Today, I wanted to talk about de-dollarization and what it means for Kenya. The dollar is dying. There is a new emerging global trend of replacing the dollar with a different reserve currency and with a different trading currency. Very many nations are now dissatisfied with the use of the dollar in international trade, and they are seeking to replace it with different methods of settling international debt. There are very many reasons why the US dollar is dying. This is tied to the fact that the United States as a global empire is beginning to collapse. It's on its decline phase, and anyone who analyzes these things can foretell that the US is on its way out. And as expected, when a great empire collapses, there is normally a struggle for influence and power in its wake. This is the struggle that we are seeing. The nations of the world are beginning to prepare for the eventual certainty that the US will fade away. The US dollar is tied to American power and prestige. And so, with American prestige and power being at an all-time low, the US dollar is also on shaky ground. Many American enemies cannot wait to replace it and are actively building out a new system of international settlement, international trade that does not involve the United States. There are very many reasons for this. One of the major reasons why the US dollar is dying is global inflation. The entire globe is suffering from severe inflation of prices. In other words, the cost of goods is going up, but the incomes of the people is remaining the same. And this is creating tremendous dissatisfaction all over the world as the price of food has become very expensive. This inflation is caused by the US dollar and the fact that everyone is dependent upon its stability. American policy has resulted in tremendous inflation both within and without the United States. The policy that the US government has been pursuing for the past 4 or 5 years is called quantitative easing. This is just a very complicated way of saying printing money out of thin air. And in fact, the US central bank, called the Federal Reserve, just announced that every month that they shall be printing 85 billion US dollars every single month. Now, what you need to understand is that this is paper currency. They are printing it out of thin air. And they have been doing so that they can give their population handouts. They call it the stimulus check, which every single American receives. But the people who are actually paying for that stimulus check is other countries across the world. Because the thing that protects Americans, even while they print vast amounts, trillions of dollars from a currency collapse, is the fact that other countries use the US dollar for trading. So they print it and other countries collect it and use it for trade. So that makes the Americans tremendously wealthy and other countries not so wealthy. Now, this is the way the system works so that you can understand clearly how America became so rich. The US prints vast amounts of dollars. Now, a dollar is simply a paper with ink on it, okay? That's all it is, a piece of paper with ink. Now, they print lots of these pieces of paper. They put them on a plane and they ship it to China. And in exchange, the Chinese give them actual goods, actual electronics, all sorts of manufactured goods. The Americans continue and print even more dollars and they ship it to Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia sends actual oil. The Americans print even more dollars, ship it to Africa, and in exchange, Africa sends America minerals, coffee, all sorts of things. So America doesn't produce much except printed paper, and they can print these papers to infinity, which means their wealth is infinite. Can you imagine if you had a money printer under your bed? You'd be the richest person in Kenya. Why? Because if you need anything, you just print those pieces of paper, go to a shop, collect actual goods, isn't it? So that's the scam that America runs on the world, which has resulted in them becoming unbelievably wealthy. Now, other nations are aware of this and they are not happy about this. They can see the scam. They are not foolish. But why don't they change the system? In past times, it was very difficult to change the system. Even right now, it's not very easy to change the system because any person, any nation that tried to change from this system, the US military would attack and destroy them. Let me give you an example. You remember Gaddafi? Gaddafi said that he's going to create a gold-based currency called the gold dinar that would be used by all African countries to the exclusion of the US dollar. The US military, acting together with the Europeans, attacked and had him brutally killed in front of the TV cameras, while African leaders cheered. they were using Gaddafi as an example to show all other leaders what would happen to them if they attempt to move from the US dollar, especially if you're a small country. Saddam Hussein of Iraq also tried to move away from the dollar, and you saw what happened to him. He was brutally killed by the Americans. The other way this scam works, because you may ask, why do we necessarily need dollars? Well, this is why we necessarily need dollars. If you want to buy oil, the oil producers would not sell you oil in any other currency. In other words, you're Kenya, right? You go to Saudi Arabia and say, look, we need 200 million gallons of oil, for example, and here's Kenya shillings. The Saudis would say, we will not accept your Kenya shillings. Okay, so you go back, you look for gold, you go to Saudi with gold, say, here's gold worth the oil, give us oil. They will say, no, we won't accept gold. So what will you accept? We will only accept the US dollar. So you as Kenya, you're forced to go to America with your resources so that the Americans can give you their dollars. So that's how the blackmail works. That's why you need dollars. So you take your coffee, in the case of Kenya, and you ship it to America. In exchange, they give you pieces of paper called dollars. And then you take those pieces of paper to Saudi Arabia. You give it to them, they give you oil. So you're in constant need for US dollars. That's why these poor countries like Kenya, small economies, are always in a cash crunch. They're always looking for foreign exchange. For what? To be able to do international trade. Because even the settlement system of international trade is based upon dollars. So this is why poor countries remain poor, because of the difficulty in finding dollars. And this is why they're able to be put under American blackmail through sanctions. Because if the Americans are not happy with you, they deny you dollars. So when you go to Saudi to buy oil, you can no longer buy oil because you don't have US dollars. And the Americans are refusing to give you US dollars. Why? Because they are trying to force you to do something that you do not want. So the fact that the world uses the American dollar as the reserve and the trading currency gives the Americans tremendous amount of power over very, very many nations. And for many years, people have been angry. Nations have been angry at this system, but they did not have the means to change it until now. So the current move towards de-dollarization is based upon tremendous resentment that many countries have had towards the Americans. For many years, countries could not change this system because the economies were too small. At the end of the 1940s, when the Americans set up the Bretton Woods institutions, which is the international system of settling debt and doing trade, at that time, the US economy was massive. And the rest of the countries around the world were just emerging from European colonialism that had rendered them very, very poor with very tiny economies. The international system of settlement works like this. The IMF and the World Bank and all these other banks that are controlled by Americans, this is where the system works. Every country in the world opens an account in those institutions. Like the country has a bank account, and the country has to deposit a certain amount of gold in order to be able to trade globally. So for example, Kenya would have a certain amount of gold or hard currency deposited in our account at IMF. And we use that account to borrow and pay and settle our debts. And it is dollar denominated. Now, this gives the Americans tremendous amounts of power over nations such as Kenya, because they can seize your account anytime, because the physical account, the physical deposit is held by them. In other words, if we have gold in our account at IMF or World Bank, the gold is not in Kenya. It is physically in the West. So they can seize it at any point. Remember when the Ukraine war started, the Americans seized all the gold and the deposit that belonged to Russia. They just took it because they could. And you remember when the Americans and the EU were putting sanctions on Venezuela. And they were putting sanctions on Venezuela because Venezuela had told poor countries in South America that they did not need US dollars to buy Venezuelan oil. That they could come with their commodities, they could come with their currencies, they could do barter trade, and they were making the American dollar irrelevant, which is why the Americans have been attacking Venezuela for a long time and tried to collapse it. So what happened was that the British simply stole $1 billion worth of Venezuelan gold that had been deposited as part of the international settlement system. Because of this lawlessness, many nations are feeling that we have to move away from the West, because they can steal your money anytime, they can steal your gold anytime, they respect no rule at all. So sanctions is simply a way of warfare. It's economic warfare on very poor countries. You saw what happened when Zimbabwe, the Africans of Zimbabwe took back their land from the Europeans who had stolen it a century before. The West Other Europeans put Zimbabwe on sanctions. What that meant was that they blocked their account at the settlement institution so that Zimbabwe found it very difficult to trade. And that led to hyperinflation in Zimbabwe and tremendous economic problems for the people of Zimbabwe. So many nations are saying this is not fair, that a few nations control everyone else and can use their power to blackmail everyone. These are some of the pressures that have been there in the background. People really thinking, how can we escape from the grasp and the control of the West? And as of late, you've seen the US government has been pushing African countries to adopt LGBTQ laws in their country. They are trying to force things which these countries consider to be abhorrent and unacceptable to their values and their culture. And they are using their power over the dollar to blackmail these small countries, that we will seize your account if you don't promote this behavior that you find unacceptable. So many nations are saying they are so done with the American dominated system. They're done with it. They want a new system. They want systemic change. And for many years, nothing could be done about it, because these nations were very small, and they could not go against America, which had a massive economic advantage. If you are to see the numbers, you would understand why the Americans had such a huge advantage. But it's 2023 and the situation is different. The small nations have now grown up. They have more power. In other words, think of a schoolyard bully who is maybe 5 years older than the rest of the children, and he's very big. But over time, the small children also grow up and become also big, and the schoolyard bully is no longer able to bully them so easily. So fast forward from the 1940s, when America took over the global reserve currency, to today. In 1950, China had a very tiny GDP. So did most countries in the world, right? But now in 2023, China is the same size in economic output like America, and will surpass America over the next 15 to 20 years. Countries such as India, their GDP has tremendously exploded. Even Kenya, our GDP has increased. We are no longer as poor as we were 15 or 20 years ago. So in other words, the schoolyard bully is now beginning to get serious problems because the other kids have grown up. And now the other kids are saying they need a new system where they cannot be bullied by one person, that they can't allow one person to get so much power that he's bullying everyone else. So people are saying we need a new system of international settlements. We need to de-dollarize. We need to move away from the Americans who have been bullying and sanctioning everyone left, right, and center, disrupting trade, trying to control countries, trying to dictate to countries, telling this country you can't trade with so and so, you cannot trade with so and so, and people are exhausted having to accommodate themselves to the global white supremacy system, especially a country like China, which remembers its century of humiliation. And they are saying they will never allow themselves to be in that position again. And so they want a new system that is not based upon the West. And China and India and Russia are big enough, and Brazil, they're strong enough to set up their own system. Last month, BRICS, BRICS, which stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, their GDP collectively surpassed the GDP of the G7. Now, the G7 has been the largest economies of the world for a very long time. But just last month, BRICS surpassed them in output. And this is projected to grow so that by 2030, BRICS will account for 50% of global GDP. In other words, power is moving away from the West to other regions. Now, the BRICS are saying that they want to launch their own currency, and they want to launch their own trading system bypassing the West and bypassing the US dollar. Many countries are eagerly waiting for this to happen in order to escape Western clutches and Western control. This new BRICS currency and BRICS bank will be used for international settlement, thereby freeing very many nations from the need to go around begging for US dollars. This is projected to grow international trade amongst poor countries. There are very many methods that the nations of the world are using to limit their exposure to US sanctions by dumping the US dollar. One of the ways is that countries are trading in each other's currency rather than the US dollar. For example, Kenya and Uganda want to trade. The traditional way of doing it, or the neocolonial way of doing it, is for Uganda to look for US dollars, for Kenya to look for US dollars, and then use the US dollar to clear the debt between the two countries. Now, the new way that is emerging is Kenya holds Uganda shillings and Uganda holds Kenya shillings, and they trade, and then they use their own currencies to settle the debt without having to look for US dollars, thereby making the US dollar irrelevant. The other thing that is happening is that the new BRICS countries, the other way countries are seeking to escape the US dollar and the exposure to US sanctions, is by limiting the use of the SWIFT system. Now, anyone who works in banking understands that the global way of moving US dollars around is called SWIFT. Now, there's a new system that has been created called the SUCRE, SUCRE, and this is designed to replace the SWIFT system that the Americans use to put so many countries under sanctions. Perhaps the greatest threat to the US dollar is the fact that oil producers are beginning to move away from the US dollar, because traditionally, or under neocolonialism, under the Bretton Woods system, oil was always pegged to the US dollar, so that you could never buy oil unless you had US dollars. And any country, any oil producing country that tried to move away from the US dollar was attacked by the US military. But right now, many of the oil producing nations are beginning to accept different forms of currency other than the US dollar, greatly weakening it. In fact, we saw the other day, like maybe a week ago, Kenya penned an agreement with Middle Eastern oil producers to buy the oil using Kenya shillings. Now, this is unprecedented and never heard of before, showing how much the US dollar has weakened in global trade. China has led the world in creating a new barter system. Very many countries have minerals, and Chinese have manufactured products. So China goes around the world to poor countries and gives them a trade deal that is based upon barter trade. For example, they could go to a country like Congo with its vast mineral wealth, and they make a deal. They simply tell them, listen, give us these minerals. In exchange, we'll give you the manufactured products that you need, all without needing the US dollar. It's a direct barter trade. And this is a very big deal because recently, China signed a trade deal with Russia, and India also signed a trade deal with Russia that is based upon barter trade, so that Russia is able to sell vast quantities of oil to both India and China, not in exchange for US dollars, but in exchange for manufactured goods and other commodities, thereby rendering the US dollar completely irrelevant. And these are huge economies that are refusing to use the US dollar because they want to limit the exposure to US sanctions. Therefore, the Americans have sanctioned the dollar into irrelevance. And there's also a new trend whereby gold is coming back into fashion as a currency. Many nations are beginning to trade in gold, so that if you have gold, you can go to those nations and purchase what you need from them. Now, this trend has accelerated with so many countries now beginning to demand their gold reserves to be pulled from the Bretton Woods institutions. People are saying, give us back our gold. The gold that we deposited in IMF and the World Bank and the IBC, give it back to us. Very many nations are demanding their gold back. Kenya hasn't demanded its gold back. And they're doing this because of Western lawlessness. You remember that when the US and the EU wanted to destabilize Venezuela, because Venezuela was providing oil very cheaply to Cuba and other poor South American countries without the use of US dollars, they seized Venezuelan gold that was worth $1 billion. They just stole it. And Venezuela went to court, and the European courts did not order England to give Venezuela back its gold, because you know the West generally is very corrupt. They never go against themselves. So even the court said that the British had the right to steal Venezuelan gold, which is outrageous, right? So with that being said, many nations are saying, okay, give us back our gold. Yeah, because if there is no law preventing you from stealing the gold reserve just because the bank is in your territory, then give me back my gold. So many nations are pulling their gold from Washington and from Europe. And countries like China are beginning to accumulate vast quantities of gold. In fact, there's a scramble for gold. China almost has 6,000 tons of gold. And countries like Iran are saying, we will sell you oil for gold. If you have gold, come buy anything. So there's a scramble. All the nations are beginning to scramble for gold. Why? Because gold is the safest store of value. You never go wrong having gold in your pocket. And we all know, he that has the gold makes the rules. With that being said, that brings us to the topic in hand. How should Kenya respond to de-dollarization that is happening across the globe? With the end of the American era approaching, Kenya should take steps to protect itself from the turmoil that is bound to come when one empire collapses and another one arises in its place. There's usually an intermediary period where there's absolute chaos and everyone's scrambling to get the maximum that they can get. So we know once America collapses, there will be very many wars. Not only physical wars, but also economic wars. And the war has already begun, and it is the war for gold and precious metals. Every country that is trying to mitigate the effects of de-dollarization is beginning to accumulate gold and precious metals. So Kenya also should accumulate gold and precious metals. Currently, at CBK, our gold reserves do not amount to more than 120 million shillings worth. This is nothing. In other words, basically, for all practical purposes, we don't have any gold reserves, right? And the CBK, in a decision that they made last week, ruled out accumulating gold. So every other reasonable and mature and intelligent country is accumulating gold, and they are demanding their gold back from the United States and Europe. But the CBK said that they will do the exact opposite of what everyone else is doing, that they will not hold gold, that they will continue to hold US dollars that are being phased out globally. This is incredibly irresponsible and unbelievably incompetent. So why did the CBK say that? Again, we are ruled by coconuts. That simply means that the brainwashed element in the elite is acting in the best interest of the West rather than in our own best interest. It is not in our interest to put all our savings in the US dollar that they are printing to infinity, that everyone is beginning to reject, because we might just end up holding worthless fiat currency. The safest place to store your value is gold and precious metals. So us in Kenya, we are screwed because the coconuts are determined to act in our worst interest. The other thing that Kenya needs to do is to immediately stop all gold exports and to nationalize all gold mines. Every gold mine in Kenya should be the property of Kenyans, and no one should be allowed to remove gold from Kenya. But you remember in 2016, Parliament passed a law saying that Africans in Kenya are not allowed to possess gold. I want you to think about that. There's an actual law in the books that says it is illegal for you as an African in Kenya to possess gold. I am not exaggerating. That law says any gold that is found in Kenya belongs to the British. I am not exaggerating. And is supposed to be taken to England. Which is why as you walk around Nairobi, you will never find a gold shop. I'm not talking about jewelry. If you wanted to buy 20 kilos of gold right now, you're saying, I do not want to buy a plot. I do not want to build flats. I want to buy gold. I want to buy 20 kilos of gold. Where can you go to buy such gold? Nowhere. There isn't any gold being sold in Kenya because it is illegal for Africans in Kenya to possess gold. Now we have a very huge gold mine in Narok, and I always talk about this. And it has millions of tons of mineable ore. It belongs to the British. They dig up the gold, it goes to England. So while Kenya doesn't have any gold reserves, because the government has handed over, we are a gold producing nation. I want you to think about that. We have gold mines and we have no gold reserves. England doesn't have any gold mines, but they have vast amount of gold reserves. Where does the gold come from? Foolish nations such as Kenya. It's the coconuts that control Kenya that guarantee our poverty. That they export the gold while everyone in the world is trying to hold on to gold as the safest store of value. You go to very many countries, their citizens are beginning to ditch currency, fiat currency, paper currency, and they're beginning to put their savings in actual gold. You're better off having 20 kilos of gold hidden under your bed than having 20,000 US dollars. Because the inflation that is eroding the value of the US dollar means that your 20,000 today will not have the same purchasing power in 1 year's time or in 5 years' time. And if the US goes, there goes your money. But gold never loses value. If you keep it under your bed, it will be under your bed. But the government that is in Nairobi refuses to consider a total ban on the export of gold. Now I want you to think about this. Zimbabwe and Ghana introduced the gold coin. Zimbabwe said that they're going to begin using gold as a currency so that they have gold coins that you can go to Zimbabwe and actually buy gold. Why? Because Zimbabwe produces gold just like Kenya. Ghana also said they're going to have gold as their currency. How are they able to do this? Ghana actually produces gold, right? And the Americans are not very happy about that because they realize if Africans begin to use gold that they produce as their currency, suddenly they become irrelevant. Because the person with the gold is the person who's rich, not the person with US dollars. Those are just papers, right? Instead of Kenya following this good example by these African countries, the coconuts that are in charge will never act in our best interest, which is for us to have gold coins. So that if you want to ditch your Kenya shillings, which is losing value every day, and it's not good to save, you can say, oh, I've saved 1,000,000 shillings. But I'm telling you, in 2 years, your 1,000,000 shillings is worth 700K. You just lost 300,000 into thin air. But if you had bought gold, if you had some gold coins, they never lose value. In the history of the world, gold has never lost value. The other measure that Kenya needs to take is to slowly begin moving away from the Bretton Woods system. We need to join the Sucre. I'm not saying we quit the SWIFT system. No, but we also need to join the Sucre system. And given the expected fallout from a US currency collapse, we need to take preparatory steps to mitigate the consequences of such an eventuality. We do not know when it will happen, but everyone suspects that it will happen sooner rather than later. And we need to take steps to protect ourselves in the coming turbulence that will be very disruptive for any nation that doesn't have a lot of resources, such as Kenya. We cannot afford just to sit and be idle and while watching global trends and not taking any action to protect ourselves. We are not a rich nation. We don't have a lot of resources that we can use. So we need to take every measure right now to build a buffer just in case the US dollar suffers a final collapse. Kenya as a nation is holding a lot of paper currency that is described as hard currencies. But these hard currencies, which are generally Western currencies, are being upended by the emerging new global order. So it is not in our interest to hold so much paper as our reserve. We are better off going with precious metals, and it is also in our interest to see whether we can associate ourselves even more strongly with the BRICS nations, which are the newly emerging global bloc. So while Zimbabwe and Ghana has shown the way forward, in conclusion, Kenya is screwed. The CBK has said that they will do nothing to prepare our economy for the shockwaves that will happen when the dollar is finally replaced. They have said they will take no action, no mitigating policy or anything. They will not accumulate gold. They will not move our reserves from foreign paper currency. They will not encourage a gold coin to be used by the people. And they will not encourage Parliament to pass any law to decriminalize the possession of gold by Kenyan citizens. And they are doing this in order to keep the Americans happy. And there you have it. The coconuts have just destroyed our future. So good luck.